taking you to what we call 434. Now I'm going to cross south from 434 on 427. We're going to go down, and then very soon on your right, you're going to come to Marvin. And on the corner of Marvin was Scott's Garage. Scott's Garage opened in the late 40s, run by Bud and Eula. And Eula, his wife, had been a 4-acre, which I'll get to. And then they lived in a 2-story house behind the garage. And they had 2 sons. Glenn was in my graduating class. And on the other side of Marvin, that property was owned by the Nichols with 2 L's, Nicholl, Catherine and C.P., Clarence Putman. And the next piece of property was owned by the Nichols with 1 L. That was Nick and Elda. And I found out through much diligence that Elda was the daughter of Catherine and Clarence. Elda married Nick, whose given name was Clarence. So Elda Nichols became Elda Nichols. And that was just great. And Elda was wonderful. She could do anything. She was a photographer, she was a writer, she was a dancer. And in the 50s, those were the days, if anybody remembers, of the jingle writing contests. You'd write a jingle and send it in. My mother did all the time. And there was a movie made about it. But Elda won a jingle contest sponsored by the Ed Sullivan Show on TV, and she won a 1955 Mercury car, which was always parked on their driveway, which is really, really neat. And next, we're going south now. Next, you have Orange Grove, which was my parents' Orange Grove, and we lived in the next piece of property, and it was a little place called Shady Villa Farm. And this is a painting of it because it's all torn down. But this was .427. This was all Orange Grove, all Orange Grove. That's where the new Lyman High School is right now. This was our yard. And then to the left of the driveway was the Martin house. And the drive, we would park under, I didn't do anything. They would park under the shade. And then at the end of the driveway was a rental cottage, which was rented to really interesting people. And, and we would, it was a nice little, tiny little place. And then the driveway went on down around there, and it went to the back, and that was the barn, and that was kind of their garage. We would play house in there and stuff, but came around and parked in there. And the railroad tracks were right behind. And you notice there's Orange Grove to the right of us, Orange Grove to the south of us, Orange Grove to the west of us, Orange Grove surrounded on 4 sides by orange groves. So then the next orange grove belonged to the 4 acres. And one of the 4-acre daughters, I suppose, had been married to Bud Scott. 4 acres lived there. Then across the street, diagonally from them, were the Moons. They lived on the corner of 427 and the Dog Track Road. And where we had the little sign that said Shady Villa Farm, they had a little sign that was carved like a little crescent moon. And I looked at that sign all the time. Anyway, they had the store downtown. And there was a Dog Track Road. And going straight though, you'd come eventually to Lyman High School. See, we've only gone not even 2 miles from downtown. So, excuse me. The Lyman there was still 1 through 12 at the time. And as Tom told me, the road used to go behind Lyman. And I remember that was like what we call it, the back parking lot or something like that. I would walk to school and would walk that way. But Lyman, of course, was started in 1924. Everyone in this room knows that. And in 40 was the first football team. And I saw an article in the paper, because I didn't get newspapers.com and I read all these old articles. In 1940, Lyman had 64 students. But in 1941, at a football game, there were Swafford family, there were 4 Swafford brothers. And according to the sports writer, the Swafford boys were the backbone of the football team and the basketball team. And so Carl Swafford, who became a dry cleaner owner, made the suggestion that maybe the dog track could sponsor the football team, and then we would become the Lyman Greyhounds, which they did. So in 1941, they became the Greyhounds. Then now I'm going to go back in front of Shadyville Farm again. And the reason that we were there is because my father, excuse me, was an avid gardener. He collected all kinds of plants. We lived down in College Park. And grew a lot of tropicals, as apparently they do. And in the late 50s, there were a couple of bad freezes. It's funny, you mentioned the freeze of 58. Well, all his tropicals were killed, except for this little plant, a daylily. And he thought, what is this? So he got interested in the daylilies and then began to collect and grow daylilies. Well, he outgrew that yard and then was looking for a big space to grow the daylilies, which he found at the 5-acre property up in Longwood. So we moved down to Longwood. We went through Hurricane Donna. A tree that was beside our house, where it is, blew over, cracked the house. My sister and I thought that was just so exciting, and my parents didn't like it. So planted all those daylilies. Well, unfortunately, as Tom said, we're high and dry. Citrus likes high and dry. Usually my father always told me if you live in a house that was in a citrus grove, you're high and dry and you're sandy. So the soil at the Shadyville Farm was sand, wouldn't grow the daylilies. So then one day he went up the road to the little property beside the Big Tree Park, and Charlie Wales, who had a fernery down by Lyman, grew and sold caladiums down there. And so Daddy went to buy some caladium bulbs. And he said he was talking to Charlie Wales, and he kind of, said, you got some real good soil here, Charlie. Charlie said, yeah, I know. And he said, but I'm renting this space from old man Hasty next door, but I'm gonna let my lease go, so if you wanna take the lease over, go. And so Daddy ran next door. Old man Hasty was in the concession stand there in the park, and they did the deal, so Daddy became the tenant of the 5 acres next to the Big Tree Park. And he talked to Mr. Hasty. Now, old man Hasty turned out to be Virgil, who they called Doc Hasty, who they had moved here to Florida, Sanford, in the 20s. And in 1939, if you remember, the WPA came to town and built the pavilion downtown, and they wanted, the county and the commissioners wanted the WPA to build a road to this giant cypress tree that was back in the woods back there. They wanted to build a park around the tree and build a road to the park. So in 1939, they got the road done, dirt road, and the WPA started clearing out the woods around the big tree. And then Mr. Hasty was the foreman of that crew, and he saw the 5 acres next door, and he said, may I buy it? So he bought the property, 5 acres, from the Overstreet Land Company, and proceeded then to clear that property, and then planted a grove right up next to the park property. And it was a fancy fruit grove, which means there's a little of everything, and it was a U-pick grove. He'd come in and U-pick it and take it. And then on the front of that property was a souvenir shop. This is from a photograph that it came via Jim Robeson. It was built out of cypress, of course, and you notice this is a giant cypress stump, and you walked through, they had cut a door, you walked through the tree to get into the souvenir shop. And they sold orange juice from the grove in the back. And my father said it burned down, but I'm not clear on dates or anything, but but the slab is still there. I rake it off and sweep it off every year. But, so that was the property, collecting my wits. And now meanwhile, Merle and Evelyn Kent had that little farm, Shady Villa Farm. They sold the farm, moved into downtown Longwood. They moved into that house right there. It was the house that Jess Cottingham built in 1956. They lived there until he died in 1961. And then my parents bought it in 1971. And they lived there, and at that time, Longwood had grown, Seminole County had grown, and the traffic was getting kind of heavy because the post office was right next to them. The Johnsons had turned into the Little Dixie, and then the city works, was there where the park used to be. And so there was a lot of traffic at that intersection. My mother and her friend, Grace Pololian, worked hard, and they managed, they didn't do it single-handedly, but a traffic light was put in, and I think it was due to a lot of my mother's diligence. But they were really happy living there. My mother liked to watch everyone go by, and Daddy was close to his dailies up there. And then in the late 60s, Doc Hasty passed on, and Mrs. Hasty retired from being the cafeteria manager at Seminole High School, and she also was running this concession stand that they had built in the park. And she retired, moved over to the beach to be with her daughter. And then she called my father, Howard, got a hold of him, and said, "Mr. Kent, do you think you'd like to buy that property?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am." And so they bought the property, sold the little house in Longwood, and built a house out there. And that's where my husband and I live today. That's it.
I have a question. Who did those beautiful paintings that you showed us?
I did. When something's gone, it's gone, and it makes me feel better to know that it makes me able to see it. So.
Makes us feel
Kathleen,
Mm-hmm.
on another note, Ellen Nichols was one of our members.
I know. I couldn't say everything,
I know.
I had
Those of you
condensed
that
this
don't
down
know,
to
she was a long time member of
I
the
know.
society.
It was in her obit, but like I said, I was just cutting things down.
She joined until she died.
Yeah.
She would send her money in every year,
Yeah.
even though she was not active after a while.
And now I'll pick up from the 1970s.
Right, Judy.
I came in 1973.
It doesn't count.
It doesn't count.
I have a question.
I never lived alone.
Tom, this is a question for you. Did you talk about this burned out house or did I miss it? Why is it on here?
I know, I
told
just,
me to put it on there.
yeah, I was gonna talk about it. On the one down on Jackson, or by the Jackson Jessup
Yeah,
Street,
something like that.
there was a big old home that sat down in the woods down there, and as kids, we'd go down, cause the old, foundation's still there, and we'd dig for glass and for bowls and things like that, and we found them. We found pieces from the old house. But, also there was a big old house that sat right in the back of our house on, Bay Street, and that thing burned. It was a big 2-story house, and that burned in the early 20s. So there are a lot of places that, burned. The one thing I might say, and then I think we're about it, finished. Longwood, again, was a southern town, but believe me, we were different than most. We were in many ways very conservative, but we were also very liberal. It was a very welcoming town. We had the gambling at the horse track in Castleberry, dog track here in Longwood, and in Fern Park, the High Line. And then on top of that, Longwood had more bars and restaurants than anybody else. We were proud of those things too. And people would leave the dog track and come in to Longwood to drink. It's interesting to note, we never thought anything about it. You know, there were 3 churches in Longwood: Baptist, Episcopal, and the Church of God that came in the 60s. So, in a nutshell, we were it was a progressive little town. We had leaders that wanted to remain as it was, and then we had leaders that wanted it to grow. You know the name Longwood, what it stands for, were the beautiful trees. Now, because of the storms and because of new growth and buildings, a lot of our beautiful trees are gone. And that's one thing I'd love to see start. I know they had some sort of thing going in Longwood, but about replanting trees. But Longwood needs to replant its trees and live up to its name of Longwood, because that's what set us apart from everybody else. We were beautiful oak trees that were in our area. Anyway, you live in a unique place. We all live in a unique place. I was fortunate to grow up here, as well as Kathy. I look back on the memories of the people that we encountered, and they were good people. Good people. You had your, sure you had some that were rough, and believe me, we had our fair share of them in Longwood. But for the most part, you had very good people. And you should be proud of your community. Yes, ma'am.
Milwee Middle School, can you tell us all about it?
Yeah, Milwee Middle School. Was
Yeah.
my father.
Is he an educator or?
Yeah, he started out, as Kathy said, about the football team and the basketball team. Started out as a coach at Milwee.
His name was in
at
that
Lyman.
article about the
Really?
Swapper boys, yeah.
Yeah, he started out as their coach. He met my mother at Milwee, at Lyman. They fell in love and got married. Then, as time progressed, he became principal. During the Second World War, he took a lead and fought both the Pacific and the Atlantic theaters of the war. Came home after the war and continued being principal of Lyman. Then he ran for school superintendent for Seminole County, and he won. From that day on, he worked until 1968, 69, when integration started, when they were integrating. And because my father was a forward thinker and believed in equal rights, he was disliked by a lot of people in Seminole County. They couldn't get him at the ballot box, but one day a man went into his office in Sanford and beat him up because his daughter had been placed in a black teacher's class at Seminole High. Now, at that point, he determined, I'm not going to put up with this. I have a family. I just can't continue living like this. He also built, when Payne came in as superintendent, he built a new school. Well, the new school was a black school in Sanford. And you would think that the people in Sanford went crazy when they found that the money was going to be spent on a black school versus whites. The reason being, the blacks had no decent schools. They had secondhand books from the whites, and the teachers were on another pay scale than the white teachers. And my father changed all of that. I guess my father came up in the era of George Smathers, those type of the Kennedys that believed that everybody should be treated fairly. So after the incident at the county school office where he was assaulted, then my father got in his head that Seminole County needed a community college. And he worked hard, very hard, to establish Seminole Junior College. In fact, he went to Tallahassee most of the time, he signed the bonds to build it. And he was the one that hired President Weldon, who's a dear friend of ours, to head Seminole Community College. He was there for about 25 years as vice president of Seminole and then emeritus of Seminole College administration. He retired in about 1998, sometime in there. He started traveling a lot, and he got to do things he wanted to do. He went back to enlisted in the Second World War. He got to see places that he had participated in for 20 years. And then in 2003, he passed away, and it was solely from old age. But
In that house.
in that house across the street.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Now, that house, like I said, was our family
It's
home.
haunted now.
Yeah.
I bet it is.
And, the old house, believe it or not, our post office box from 1915-16 to 2003 remained the same, P.O. Box 201, Longwood, Florida.
Wow.
And, no, he was a major part of Longwood, and, he grew up in Louisiana, East Texas primarily, and moved to Florida during the Depression. And married my mom, who was living over here. She was a teacher at Lyman, and her last name was Levine. And her father was the one that bought the old place and fixed it up, and they moved from downtown Orlando out here to Longwood. And they were farmers. They had a big truck farm up here at where Winter Springs High School is now. There's subdivisions all around here. That was their farmland. But a lot of changes, a lot of things we've seen change, but you've lived in a nice area. I just wish the citrus groves were still around, because it was such a wonderful place to live and be a part of. But it really, things haven't changed that much as far as people, I believe. I taught at Milwee, my wife taught at Milwee, and then at Rock Lake, and then we went to Lake Brantley. And the people remained the same. You know, good people. And I look back, maybe we don't have any, movie stars or anything, but by God, they're all good people. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, professional people, people that have added to society. And I think that's one thing you can say about Longwood. It was a little town that you had your Northerners, and they were accepted in Longwood, believe me. People from out of state. It was always a constant movement of people in. So I think there's a lot to be said about this place and the folks that lived here, and I commend you for trying to carry through and get
I
this
think this is wonderful.
Yeah, I think it's really nice that you do.
I taught at Milwee, and you would ask the kids, where's the city center? Where's downtown? And it was always right here.
Yeah.
It was always right there. That's what they see is downtown Longwood.
I had the privilege of knowing your father because when I started next door in '91, he'd sit on that porch in his
Yeah.
rocking chair.
And wave to
And
them.
I'd come to work, he'd wave, and when I'd get ready to go home, if he was out there, he'd wave. And he called me over one day and said, I wanna give you this book. And it was a book on Altamont Springs, because that house was in Altamont
Right.
Springs for 100 years.
Do you
And
remember when
he
that
did-
was moved?
I wasn't here then,
That
but
was
it was
the
in
biggest-
70.
Oh, yeah, that
Is
was
that
like
included
a-
when the houses
Yeah.
were moved in?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
that
the
was
Oh,
biggest-
it's unreal.
73.
That was the biggest
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
in the world.
And
You were excited.
That was
Yeah.
entertainment.
He was a true gentleman and he was a solid gentleman.
I want to add one thing, guys.
Yeah.
This is totally something personal. Kathy wrote a book, and we're not trying to sell her anything.
I didn't write the book, my mother
Her
wrote it.
her mother wrote it, and it's about Longwood, about the Big Tree Park, and their growing of the daylilies. It is a beautiful book. I wish that you would look at it just to see the artwork that's in it that she did. And it's just a beautiful cocktail table book, and it shows the history of that area that we live in. And I think you'd be really
These are
impressed.
musings on the back of
Yeah.
grocery lists and
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
else.
Well, the funny thing about it, I said in the chapter of the book, that my mother had been a legal secretary, and she wrote a lot of shorthand. She would write notes to herself in shorthand, notes to my father in shorthand. And I found these old steno pads, and all of a sudden I realized I was writing her thoughts about where they lived. And I thought, how interesting. This is just a few years ago. And they've been gone 35 years. And I turned the page over, and the rest was in shorthand. And so I had to dig around and find someone who did shorthand. And there was a woman who was very elderly at this point, and I said, she lived in a senior citizen place, and I said, does anyone here do shorthand? And she said, I do. And I said, all right. So she transcribed it, is that the word, and for me. And she said, your mother was really good. She said, this is hard, because I didn't know that shorthand was very much how you speak, you know, so, she worked real hard and I worked real hard.
And you two, I don't remember your names, but I just want to commend you for wanting to be part of
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like this, because so many kids, and I was one of them too, you don't realize until something's over or gone. And then you get to see the progression of everything. So take what you're doing seriously. I think all of us are, and we appreciate it. Because we won't be around forever.
Last thing, guys, some old photos, the report card from the grade school down here in Longwood. That my mother had. Pictures from a hurricane from in the early 40s. Pictures of my mom as a flapper with the car. She and Barbara Hunt during the 40s, not 40s, 20s. I got these primarily to show you what the old hotel looked like, how dirty and nasty it was compared to what it looks like
Oh, but the
today.
kitchen was on, I forgot that in old buildings, kitchens were always separate.
And, yeah, it was interesting at the time, and like I said, the people were very nice.
And I will say, one painting I forgot to show you, that was our house. Our sweet house.
Was that,
That was our house.
was that Shadyville or this?
No, the whole, this was Shadyville.
Okay.
Yeah. And the driveway.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you for inviting us, we have really enjoyed it.